Behind every perfect love story, there's a hidden truth. And for Julia Trapkina and Brandon Gibbs, stars of 90 Day Fiancé, that truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Today, we reveal the downfall of Brandon Gibbs and the heartbreaking choice Julia had to make. Brandon Gibbs got into almost $200,000 of debt because of online gambling. He kept asking Julia to help pay off the secret debt. As time went on and Brandon couldn't repay it, a lawsuit was filed against him and he was arrested. The court later sentenced him to 1 year in prison. Once the truth came out, things got even worse. Under constant pressure and stress, Julia Trapkina eventually had no choice but to divorce Brandon Gibbs. After the divorce, Julia decided to start a new life and later married a man named Zach. Let's go back to the beginning. Julia Trapkina came into 90 Day Fiancé as a lively, strong-willed woman from Russia. She was bold, honest, and never afraid to speak her mind. Brandon Gibbs, on the other hand, was a quiet man from Virginia. The two were complete opposites, but they fell in love. Brandon grew up on a farm with his parents. He was calm and traditional, while Julia was full of energy and independence. Their love story became one of the main parts of the show. Fans watched as they dealt with cultural differences, controlling parents, and the challenges of starting a new life together. At first, many fans didn't think it would work. Would Julia accept life on a farm? Could Brandon stand up to his parents, Betty and Ron? But over time, their love seemed real. Julia made fun of Brandon's shyness, and Brandon loved Julia's fiery spirit. They had fights, made up, laughed, and dreamed about their future. When the cameras were rolling, their life looked perfect. They got married, posted cute photos on social media, and talked about having kids. But behind the scenes, Brandon was hiding a terrible secret, one that would destroy everything. Brandon had developed a gambling problem. He didn't seem like someone who would fall into that trap. He was polite, quiet, and spent his days helping his parents on the farm. On TV, he looked like someone who was shy and easily influenced by others. But inside, Brandon felt something missing. One night, while Julia was on Instagram, Brandon saw an ad that said "Win big from home." He placed a $50 bet out of curiosity. When he won $120, he felt excited. For the first time, he thought he could finally give Julia more. Maybe even move off the farm. He didn't tell her, though. Julia hated gambling. He thought it was just harmless fun. Soon, fun turned into addiction. Brandon started staying up late, gambling after Julia went to bed. Some nights, he won hundreds of dollars. Other nights, he lost everything. But every time he lost, he believed that just one more bet would fix it. Eventually, he started using credit cards and payday loans. His debt went from $5,000 to $20,000, then $50,000, and finally nearly $200,000. He lived in fear, hiding bills marked final notice, and deleting emails from angry creditors. Julia started noticing the change. Brandon became distant, secretive, and moody. Their bank account showed strange withdrawals. When she asked him about it, he lied and blamed farm expenses. Julia believed him at first. She had left her whole life behind to be with him. But the lies became harder to hide. The truth came out one day when Julia checked the mailbox. Inside was a thick envelope with red letters that said "Notice of Default." It showed $200,000 in debt. That night, she laid the papers on the kitchen table. "Brandon," she said, with tears in her eyes, "what is this? What have you done to us?" Brandon stood in the doorway, frozen. For a second, he thought about lying again. But there was no way out. The truth was in front of them. Julia's voice shook. $200,000, Brandon. $200,000. She was in shock. The same Julia everyone saw on TV, bold and full of energy, was now angry and heartbroken. But this wasn't TV drama. This was real. Brandon couldn't even look at her. He said, "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I could fix it before you found out." Julia slammed the papers on the table. "Fix it? You ruined us. Do you know what this means? This isn't just your problem. This is our marriage. How could you keep this from me?" Julia felt like her world had collapsed. She had left her family and country to build a life with Brandon. Now she didn't even know who he really was. She had so many questions. Where did the money go? How could he hide so much? What else had he lied about? It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. Her hands shook as she pointed to the papers. Do you understand what you've done? They're going to take everything. They're going to destroy us. Brandon spoke quickly, panicking. It started small, Julia. Just a little here and there. I thought I could win and give us a better life. A house. I wanted more for you. Julia let out a bitter laugh. A better life? You destroyed the one we had. Do you think I care about money like that? I care that you lied. Brandon reached out to her, but she pulled away. Don't touch me. Don't you dare. The next few days were filled with pain and silence. Julia couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the debt and the lies. She thought about all their conversations, wondering how she missed the signs. Brandon tried to comfort her, but she couldn't be consoled. Their house, once full of laughter, was now cold and quiet. The phone rang constantly, calls from creditors demanding payment and threatening lawsuits. Julia felt ashamed and stuck in a nightmare she never chose. She started lashing out, her words sharp and full of anger. You've ruined us, Brandon. Do you understand? You've ruined everything. Brandon, full of guilt, became more desperate. He begged Julia to stay with him and help him fix everything. But the more he begged, the more trapped she felt. It didn't take long before the money problems turned into something worse. Brandon had missed too many payments. He had defaulted on several loans. One day, a lawsuit was filed against him by one of the online gambling companies. The official notice arrived in the mail one morning. The envelope felt heavier than anything they had ever held. Brandon opened it in silence. His face went pale as he read it. Julia grabbed the paper from his hands and read it herself. Her heart sank. This is it, she whispered. This is real. They're taking you to court. Brandon sat down slowly, his face in his hands. He had spent so long pretending this wasn't happening, but now the truth couldn't be avoided. That night, Julia sat across from Brandon at the table. Her voice was shaky but firm. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I can't live like this, Brandon. I didn't come here to watch my life fall apart. Brandon's eyes filled with tears. Julia, please don't leave me. I need you. I'll fix this. I promise. Just give me a chance. But Julia shook her head. You had your chances. So many. And every time you chose to lie. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. Now that the truth was out, everything was falling apart. Julia, the strong and outspoken woman who once smiled on 90 Day Fiancé, was now facing a future full of shame, lies, and financial disaster. She lay awake night after night, staring at the ceiling. Her mind wouldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the number, $200,000. The debt felt like a mountain she could never climb. She thought about everything she had sacrificed. She had left her family in Russia. She had given up her independence. She had taken a chance on Brandon and his promises of a good life in America. Now it all felt like a cruel joke. Next to her, Brandon couldn't sleep either. He kept turning in bed, whispering sorry over and over. But Julia no longer had the energy to respond. The silence between them became worse than any argument. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Strange numbers called day and night. Julia began to dread every ring. Sometimes she answered and heard angry voices demanding money. Other times Brandon would rush to answer and leave the room, trying to hide his shame. But there was nothing left to hide. Every letter in the mail, every note stuck to their door, reminded them of how far they had fallen. Julia felt cornered. She had to deal with the money problems and the public shame. They were reality TV stars. Fans watched them closely. How long before the truth came out online? How long before the tabloids posted their story? Julia tried to be strong. She reminded herself that marriage meant being there during hard times. But the anger grew. Every time she looked at Brandon, she didn't see the man she had married. She only saw the lies. You didn't just ruin your life, Brandon, she yelled one night. You ruined mine. Do you even care what this has done to me? Brandon looked weak and pale. His eyes were empty from stress. He could only whisper, I'm sorry, Julia. I never wanted this. But his apologies started to feel meaningless. As the lawsuit moved forward, Julia got dragged in too. Court dates were scheduled. Lawyers got involved. Every meeting, every piece of paper reminded her of how bad things had become. Julia sat next to Brandon in the lawyer's office, her arms crossed, her face tense. The lawyers talked about payment plans, possible deals, and even jail time. At one point, the lawyer looked right at Julia. If the debt can't be paid, Brandon could face serious legal consequences. Mrs. Gibbs, this will affect you too. Your shared money, your accounts, your future. Julia felt her heart sink. My future, she thought. What future? The emotional weight was becoming too much. Julia started snapping at friends, ignoring family, and avoiding social media. She couldn't pretend anymore. At home, fights with Brandon became normal. She asked questions he couldn't answer. She wanted solutions he didn't have. Do something, she screamed one night, slamming her fist on the table. Find a way out of this. Don't just sit there and wait for everything to fall apart. But Brandon had nothing to give. His quiet personality had turned into complete hopelessness. He hardly spoke. He hardly ate. Julia started to wonder if she was in a fight she could never win. One evening, after another hard day full of phone calls and papers, Julia sat alone on the couch. Tears ran down her face. This isn't what I wanted. This isn't the life I dreamed of, she whispered. For the first time, she thought about something she had avoided for a long time. Maybe I can't stay. Maybe this marriage is already over. She looked at Brandon sitting across the room. He was slumped in a chair, his eyes empty, his body broken. And then Julia understood something. She no longer saw him as her husband. She saw him as a weight pulling her down. The day of the court hearing came like a storm she couldn't stop. For weeks, she had dreaded this day. Brandon's secret life was about to be exposed in front of strangers. The man who once promised her love and safety was now taking her into a courtroom filled with shame. The courthouse felt cold. Julia walked next to Brandon, her step slow, her face pale from exhaustion. She wore a plain black dress, not to look good, but to blend in. She didn't want anyone to notice her. Brandon looked worse. His suit didn't fit. He looked thinner and more tired than ever before. As they walked in, Julia felt people looking at them. Some recognized them from TV. Others just saw a man in trouble and a woman who looked defeated. Either way, Julia wished she could disappear. Inside the courtroom, everything was quiet and serious. The lawyers spoke in short, clear sentences. They showed documents, listed debts, and explained how Brandon had failed to pay. Every number mentioned, $10, 000 here, $50,000 there, felt like a knife in Julia's chest. The prosecution said Brandon wasn't just bad with money. They said he had a gambling addiction and didn't care about his responsibilities. They showed late payment notices, screenshots of gambling websites, and bank records showing thousands of dollars lost in minutes. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, this is more than just financial trouble. This is a clear pattern of addiction, dishonesty, and irresponsibility. Julia looked down, ashamed. Every word felt like she was being judged, too, for being married to him. Brandon's lawyer tried to defend him. He said Brandon was under pressure, that he had been a hard worker on his family's farm, and that he regretted everything. Brandon stood up and spoke, his voice shaking. I made mistakes. I thought I could fix them, but I made it worse. I never meant to hurt Julia or anyone else. I take full responsibility. Julia listened, feeling torn. Part of her still cared about the man standing there, but a bigger part of her felt nothing. She had heard all these words before. After hours of talking, the judge finally gave the verdict. Mr. Gibbs, the court finds that you have repeatedly failed to meet your financial obligations, your gambling debts, your dishonesty, and your inability to resolve these matters have left no alternative. You are hereby sentenced to 1 year in prison. The words echoed through the courtroom. Brandon's face went pale, his mouth slightly opened as though he couldn't breathe. Julia's hands trembled, but she didn't reach for him. Not this time. The gavel struck, and just like that, their world collapsed. Brandon was escorted away in handcuffs. Julia watched in stunned silence as her husband, the man she once danced with, laughed with, dreamed with, was let out like a criminal. His eyes searched for hers, desperate, pleading. But Julia couldn't bring herself to look back. She stood alone in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers, her heart heavy with anger and grief. The days that followed were some of the darkest Julia had ever known. News of Brandon's sentencing spread quickly online. Fans of 90 Day Fiancé, they speculated, blogs reported, and social media filled with comments. Some pied her, others mocked her. Julia tried to ignore it, but the humiliation cut deep. She felt like the world was laughing at her pain. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they didn't know the full story, but deep down, she knew she had lost control of her own narrative. She visited Brandon once in prison during those early weeks. He looked smaller, behind the glass, his hands clutching the phone, his eyes desperate. "Julia, please," he begged. "Don't give up on me. I'll change. I'll be better. Just wait for me." Julia stared at him, her heart torn in two. But when she spoke, her words were flat, lifeless. "I don't know if I can, Brandon. I don't know if I want to." And with that, she walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of his choices alone. When the prison doors closed behind Brandon Gibbs, Julia Trapkina's life changed forever. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt completely alone. The cameras of 90 Day Fiancé were gone. The excitement of their whirlwind romance had faded, and what remained was a hollow silence that filled every corner of her life. The house they once shared felt different now. Brandon's absence was everywhere. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the silence in the evenings where his nervous laugh once filled the air. Julia would walk past. His belongings, the shirts he left behind, the pictures of their wedding tucked into dusty frames, and feel a wave of anger, sadness, and nostalgia all at once. At night, she sometimes caught herself reaching across the bed instinctively, only to find cold sheets where Brandon used to lie. But instead of comfort, the thought of him only reminded her of betrayal. Brandon tried to stay connected. From prison, he called Julia whenever he could. The color calls came at odd hours, the robotic voice always announcing before. His voice broke through. "This is a call from an inmate at Julia," he would say, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry. I think about you every day. Please don't give up on me. I'll change when I get out. I'll be better." At first, Julia answered. She listened. Sometimes she cried. Other times, she sat in silence, while Brandon poured out apologies and promises. But over time, she began to dread the calls. His words felt like chains dragging her back into a life she no longer wanted. She started letting the phone ring, ignoring his desperate attempts to cling to her. With Brandon gone, Julia faced the world alone. Friends she thought she could count on slowly drifted away, some not knowing what to say, others judging her for staying as long as she had. Even fans of the show turned against her online. Some comments mocked her. She should have known better marrying Brandon. Others pied her. Poor Julia. She gave up everything for him. But none of them knew the real pain. Julia felt trapped between humiliation and freedom. Free from Brandon's lies, but burdened with the shadow of his mistakes. Julia tried to rebuild her life. She took on more work, tried to distract herself with hobbies, and even considered moving away from the small town that reminded her of everything she lost. But it wasn't easy. Financially, she was still tied to Brandon's mess. Emotionally, she carried scars that wouldn't fade. Each time she tried to focus on herself, the past pulled her back. Even mundane things became heavy. Grocery shopping alone, paying bills by herself, walking past, couples holding hands. All of it reminded her of what she thought she had and how quickly it had crumbled. One evening, Julia sat on the couch staring at the wall, the silence pressing in on her. She thought about the years she had spent with Brandon, the sacrifices, the love, the fights, the dreams. And for the first time, she admitted to herself, "I don't love him anymore." The realization was like a weight lifted and a knife to the heart at the same time. She felt relief, but also grief for the woman she used to be. The one who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Brandon, meanwhile, wrote to her constantly, letters filled with apologies, confessions, and desperate pleas. I know I failed you, one letter. Read. I know I ruined everything, but please don't give up on me. I need you when I get out. You're all I have left. Julia read them, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing bitterly. She kept them in a drawer, unable to throw them away, but unwilling to let them soften her heart. Each letter only confirmed what she already knew. Brandon was a chapter of her life that had ended. The year that Brandon spent behind bars felt like an eternity for Julia. Each passing day was a test of her strength, her patience, and her ability to survive in a country that often felt more foreign than ever. But as the months went by, Julia's heart hardened. The love she once had for Brandon was replaced by resentment, exhaustion, and the heavy truth she could no longer ignore. She needed to let go. Julia's breaking point came one afternoon in early spring. She had just returned home from work when the phone rang. Another collect call from Brandon. Against her better judgment, she answered, Julia. Brandon's voice crackled through the line, filled with urgency. I've been thinking about us, about when I get out we can start fresh, you and me. I promise. No more lies, no more gambling. We can move forward. Just give me one more chance. Julia clenched the phone, her chest tight. For months she had listened to these promises over and over, but nothing changed. His words felt like a broken record, rehearsed and empty. No, Brandon, she finally said, her voice shaking but firm. There are no more chances. You destroyed everything. I can't do this anymore. There was silence on the other end. Then, a desperate plea. Julia, please don't say that. Don't give up on me. You're all I have. But Julia had already made her decision. For the first time, she hung up on him. That night, Julia sat at the kitchen table with a blank divorce petition in front of her. The papers looked simple, almost too simple for what they represented. The end of her marriage, the cutting of ties to the man she once believed was her soulmate. She hesitated, her pen hovering above the page. Memories flooded her mind. Their first kiss, their wedding vows, the playful moments fans had adored on 90 Day Fiancé. But then came the darker memories, the lies, the debts, the humiliation, the endless pain. With trembling hands, she began to write her name. And with each stroke of the pen, Julia felt the weight of her decision. Filing the paperwork was one of the hardest things Julia had ever done. She walked into the courthouse alone, her steps echoing in the hallway. At the clerk's desk, she handed over the documents, her heart pounding in her chest. The clerk stabbed the papers, and in that moment, Julia realized there was no turning back. She was no longer Julia Gibbs. She was Julia Trapkina again. As she walked out of the courthouse, a cold wind brushed against her face. But instead of sadness, she felt something unexpected, relief. When Brandon eventually learned about the divorce, his reaction was explosive. He called Julia from prison, his voice filled with anger and desperation. You divorced me, after everything we've been through. How could you just walk away? He shouted. Julia's voice was calm, steady. I didn't walk away, Brandon. You pushed me away. Every lie, every dollar you gambled, every time you begged and promised and failed, that was you choosing this, not me.